If your mother disappeared without trace, how long would you look for her? On the 29th of December 1969, newspaper executive Alick McKay returned from work to his home in Wimbledon. His wife Muriel was nowhere to be seen, yet the lights were on, the fire ablaze, and the contents of her handbag strewn across the floor. She'd been kidnapped. "We are Mafia M3, said a voice on the phone. "We tried to get Rupert Murdoch's wife. We couldn't get her, so we took yours instead. You have $1 million by Wednesday night, or we will kill her." 2 attempts to deliver the ransom failed. Muriel was never found, and her body never recovered. Brothers Arthur and Nizamodeen Hosein were convicted of murder and jailed for life. Arthur died in prison in 2009. Nizamodeen served 20 years and was deported to Trinidad after his release. Muriel's daughter Diane was 28 at the time she was kidnapped. Now 82, she has spent a lifetime hoping somehow, someday, to lay her mother to rest. And after more than 50 years, the man guilty of her murder now says he can lead her to where the body was buried. A curious relationship has formed between the two.
It's very hard, but have you had so many years with nobody to talk to and no leads and no hope of ever finding her body? It's actually a relief to talk to him.
I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily. To take us through this fascinating tale, I'm joined once again in the studio by our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt. Martin, good to see you. You've covered some stories in your time. This has got to be up there.
Yes, this is absolutely intriguing because, of course, it still is a mystery. And you know, Neil, I remember this story when I was a kid doing a newspaper round, and it was one of those stories that leapt out of me from the front pages of all those newspapers so many years ago. It's cropped up very occasionally in the intervening years, but it had largely been forgotten until a couple of years ago when the family tracked down Nizam, as they call him, and after all those years of denying any part in her murder, although he was convicted, and telling everybody that he had no idea what had happened to Muriel McKay, suddenly he came up with a story about what happened to her.
Let's start at the very beginning and the parts of the story that we know and were dealt with in court. Take us back to December 69. Alick McKay returns home and his wife is missing.
There was clearly signs of a struggle. Muriel's belongings, her handbag and so forth, strewn around the house. The door was unlocked. He had no idea what had happened until a phone call was received. And then over the next few days, the kidnappers played a rather elaborate cat and mouse game with the police. They wanted £1 million for Muriel's return. And there was a very famous episode where the police had a suitcase that looked like it was full of notes. Only the top layer of notes were real pound notes. It was left at the brothers' instructions in various different places. They kept asking it for it to be moved, but it eventually was left in a telephone box in Bishop Stortford. Now, Scotland Yard had not told the local cops what was going on. You would not believe this, but a woman went into the phone box to make a phone call, discovered this suitcase, looked inside, and called the local police.
Of course she would, yeah.
Who had no idea what this was all about. Police turned up and took this away, but one of the mistakes the brothers made was to cruise past the phone box, looking to see if the police were watching it. And that's eventually what led the police to them. They never got the money, they were caught, and they never revealed what had happened to Muriel. Given
that her husband was a newspaper executive, in fact, as I understand it, worked very closely with Rupert Murdoch.
He was Rupert's deputy.
I mean, this was clearly a man of means. But that phone call, that ransom phone call I mentioned in the introduction, that does suggest this might have been a case of mistaken identity.
It absolutely was. I don't think there's any doubt that the brothers had thought about kidnapping Rupert Murdoch's wife, Anna, his then wife. He had just been over here to buy the News of the World and the Sun newspapers. He was very high profile. Rupert had done an interview with David Frost that had been big news on the telly. The brothers had seen this and worked out that Rupert Murdoch was a very wealthy man. They had worked out what car Rupert Murdoch used to and from their newspaper headquarters in London. They followed it one day, chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, thinking it would take them to Rupert's home. Well, it did take them to a house. It led them to a house in Wimbledon. But what they didn't know was that Rupert Murdoch had gone back to Australia for a few weeks to deal with his business there and had lent the Rolls-Royce to his deputy, Alick McKay. So the car went to the home of Alick and Muriel McKay. So when the brothers burst in and grabbed the woman who they thought was Anna, it was Muriel, and that was their first error.
And this was taking place at a time, and correct me if I'm wrong, of high-profile kidnap and ransom requests. You know, the partners, the children, perhaps of major industrialists. But still, this must have been a case that caught both the police's attention, for obvious reasons, but the public's attention as well at the time.
Absolutely. A 55-year-old woman snatched from her comfortable home and vanished into thin air. I mean, that's certainly what appeared to be the case for the first few days until that first phone call was received by the family. And then, of course, it became a big crime story, an awful lot of sympathy for the missing woman, the intrigue of the police investigation. We now know the story of phone calls, pleas for money, the cat and mouse game that the brothers played with the police, the attempt to leave a suitcase full of money in a phone box that went badly wrong. And even after the brothers were caught, of course, and even beyond their trial, there was still no word of what had happened to Muriel.
What do we know of the brothers themselves back then, Arthur and Nizamodeen? Did they realise the scale of what they were trying to do? Were they even up to it?
I think they had no idea what they were about to unleash, and it's not really clear why they would suddenly come up with this plot. Arthur was the driving force, the older brother, and there's some evidence that he mixed with the criminal fraternity. He was ostensibly a tailor working in London, and quite why these brothers were living in a farmhouse that they owned in the beautiful Hertfordshire countryside is still a bit of a puzzle. It was a rundown farmhouse in those days, but it still came with something like 11 acres.
They weren't members of an organisation known as Mafia M3. That was the name that they gave when they gave the ransom call.
I think in his mind, Arthur might have thought he was a bit of a gangster. I guess that he used that name in the phone call just to add a bit of menace and to suggest to the family and to the police that this was a serious organised crime gang, but it wasn't. As far as we know, there was nobody else involved.
But they were convicted of murder, so one presumes that at some point during the trial, during the police investigation, they had been asked, where is she? Where is the body? Did they simply just refuse to answer? Did the police have any working assumptions?
Nizamodeen says now that he was very badly treated physically by the police. And I think, I don't know whether that's true or not, but, in those days, I think a lot of cops would accept that there were suspects that were pretty roughly treated. To this day, Nizamodeen appears to have a real fear of police officers, which is partly the reason why it's been so difficult for the family to deal with him. They denied the murder. So I suppose if you deny that you were ever involved in something, then, it's very difficult for you to give any kind of answer to the question, what happened to your victim, if you say it wasn't us.
With convictions in cases such as these, and there have been a few in more recent years where there has been an assumption of murder, a conviction of murder, but the body has not been found, those cases do tend to fade away from the public consciousness, despite the fact that the body has not been found. Was that the case with this as well?
I mean, it was a huge story at the time, principally because they were convicted without any evidence of the body. I mean, there were things like fingerprints on some of the items. There was the evidence of their car cruising past the phone box where the police had left the money as part of the ransom handover. But they never said anything to convict themselves.
And so, following the conviction, both jailed for life. Arthur died, I believe, in prison back in 2009. Nizamodeen served 2 decades and was then deported to Trinidad. What happened next? Because it's a big old what happened next in this, isn't it?
Nothing happened for a very long time. And then a documentary maker track down Nizamodeen to Trinidad. I don't know how difficult it was to find him, but clearly the evidence showed he'd been deported there. Somebody with a lot of endeavour managed to find him living away from the capital. It's people think of Trinidad and Tobago. Tobago is the place where you go for nice holidays. Trinidad is very industrialised. There's no real development of its tourist industry. Nizamodeen was found living in quite a remote part. He was persuaded to talk for the documentary maker 2 years ago, but still maintained his innocence and absolutely was adamant that he had no idea what had happened to Muriel. It was only when the McKay family saw this documentary, hired a lawyer in Trinidad to go and find Nizamodeen and spend a lot of time with him, and eventually persuaded him that, he was getting on a bit, he wasn't in the best of health, and perhaps this was the time for him to come clean. And eventually he was persuaded to.
Martin, we will pause there. When we come back, we will explore what I think everyone will discover to be something of a curious relationship, that which is formed between Nizamodeen and Diane, the daughter of the woman that he murdered. That's next. Martin Brunt, our crime correspondent, is still here taking us through this absolutely fascinating and indeed concerning story about the disappearance of Muriel McKay back in 1969. And we may well have some answers now, Martin, but let's start just with a slightly different question here. Tell me about Diane. She's now 82. She was 28 when her mother went missing. I cannot imagine what it must be like to have lived that long, being told that your mother has been killed, but not being able to lay her to rest.
She spent many years asking lots of questions of the police. She got on with her life, and she's still, at 82, incredibly sprightly, incredibly bright. She's great fun. She doesn't give you the impression of a woman who's spent years and years mourning the loss of her mother in that sense. I mean, clearly she has. Mm-hmm. I've spent a lot of time with her son, Mark, who's really been the driving force of the last 2 years to get these final answers. Diane also has been incredibly tough in the last 2 years, having to accept the fact that she can now have contact with this man who killed her mother, or was responsible for her mother's death, having to engage with him and knowing that really he is the best, perhaps the only chance of finding exactly what happened to her mother.
Does this individual, this man convicted of Muriel McKay's murder, does he have the answers? I mean, he's saying he does.
Nobody can be absolutely sure that, that he's telling the truth, although the family accept that his story has an air of authenticity to it.
What is his story?
Right, well, his story is quite bizarre. He was convicted of Muriel's kidnap and murder, but he says that she wasn't murdered. He says that she was kept at the farmhouse in Hertfordshire, and he was there one night, a few days after the kidnap, sitting with her on the sofa. The story came on the news. It was, continued to be a high-profile TV and newspaper story. And she was so shocked at seeing her family making pleas for Muriel's return, that she went into some kind of shock and collapsed and died, perhaps of a heart attack, although there's no evidence that at 55 she was other than quite fit. This is Nizam's story, and he panicked. His brother wasn't there, so he took her body out into the farmyard, 20, 30 yards behind the farmhouse, and dug a grave underneath a dung heap, and that's where he left her.
But given that the police knew of the existence of this farmhouse before the turns in events that have taken place rather more recently, you've got to assume they checked that place out from top to bottom, don't you?
I've no doubt that they did. I mean, they would have searched every inch of it, but there are 11 acres around the farmhouse. Yeah. And I suppose you might think that if they had buried her on the farm, then it wasn't going to be close to the house. Now, I don't know how much of those 11 acres they dug up. Whatever search they did, they clearly didn't find any trace of her.
and presumably over the years, this farmhouse and the kind of the surrounding land, they will have changed an awful lot in the intervening 50 plus years.
That's been the difficulty. The house is not the ramshackle place it was. It's a lovely old building that's been extended several times, I think. And of course, the layout of the barns have fallen down or been removed. They've been added to. What's important, I think, is that Nizam, when he talks about how he left the house and went through a gate and turned left to the dung heap and then buried Muriel's body, that pathway that he describes doesn't exist anymore. So one of the big issues has been, what gate is he talking about? Because it doesn't appear to be the gate that he said was there at the time. So one of the things the family have done is to create some computer-generated images, one that shows what the farmyard was like in 1970 and now what it looks like today. And they've shown these to Nizamodeen, and he has tried to marry up the two and plot much better the route he took when he carried Muriel's body out of the farmhouse into the fields and buried it. He says that if he goes there, he can show precisely the spot where he left her.
But the fact is, given that he's been deported from this country currently, there's no way he can get back in, is there, presumably?
He has applied to the Home Office to be allowed to come back. You can do that. It doesn't mean that you're banished forever, but there have to be pretty good, compelling circumstances for you to be allowed to return. And he's waiting to hear from the Home Office. The other is for Scotland Yard to get a search warrant to go and have another look. Because, of course 18 months ago, based on Nizam's first testimony, when he decided to tell a story, they did dig in a certain part of the farmyard, but the family and Nizam say they dug in the wrong place.
There is a curious relationship between Diane and her mother's murderer, that they talk over video calls. How would you describe it? Because I have to admit, when watching parts of your report, when they are talking with each other, I couldn't quite work out what to think of it.
It is bizarre, I think, when people stand back and think that the killer has a relationship of sorts with his victim's family, but he does, clearly. And I was there a week ago when Diane had a Zoom call with Nizam. I wouldn't exactly say it's a warm relationship. I mean, they greet each other relatively warmly. So it's, hi Nizam, hi Diane, how are you Nizam? All the better for seeing you, Diane. The conversation was very driven by Diane. But, this is the situation. They think there's perhaps one more chance to discover what happened to their mother.
I mean, originally you said that the police didn't look very carefully. You said they could easily have found her.
Maybe.
Do you remember saying that?
I can't remember too much.
Well, I remember you saying that they just had poles and they didn't look very carefully, and you thought they could have found her, but they did not.
Yeah.
Yes, but still we never forget my mother. That's the trouble. I know it's a long time ago, but we would be glad if you could help us.
Really?
You'd have to have a heart of stone not to wish the family get the answer they're looking for. But I think those hurdles are very, very difficult. I'm not convinced the Home Office will look well on this, and I'm not convinced Scotland Yard will want to go back. But the key thing is the Home Office haven't rejected Nizam's offer to come back, or his plea to get the deportation order lifted. And Scotland Yard are still talking to the family on a regular basis. They are poring over what Nizam has said in the past, and they are picking it apart and trying to, I suppose, convince themselves that he has got something new to offer, enough to justify a search warrant and him being flown back from Trinidad.
So why not? Martin, let's see what happens next. Thanks again for coming in. Always good to see you.
Pleasure.
And that is your lot for this edition of the Sky News Daily. We'll see you next time.